The majority of the worst arguments that I've seen made can safely be placed under the having a child for the child's sake category. The people who claim that you're doing the potential child a favor by bringing them into existence. They will say things like, just think about all the potential for joy that they would stand to experience. To which the response would be to think about all the potential for suffering that they'd stand to experience, and consider how much more visceral and persistent these states can be in comparison to states of pleasure or contentment. Consider how difficult or impossible it is to hold on to pleasure, and how difficult or impossible it is to escape from the innumerable sources of suffering that can be experienced. No escape until death, which is oftentimes a terribly crude, abhorrent process. The absolute depths of suffering are far more disvaluable than pleasure is valuable. And there are good arguments to be made that what we perceive as pleasure is merely the alleviation of some form of suffering or deprivation. That the value of pleasure lies not in the perceived pleasure itself, but in the temporary relieving of a deprivation. And if it can be said that there is any intrinsic value to be found in blissful states of being, they are far outweighed by these states of agonizing suffering. The vast majority of the good, virtually all of the good, is simply the removal, the alleviation of the bad. And the alleviation and prevention of severe suffering is of far more importance and value than the cultivation of joy or pleasure. And this is often met with something to the effect of, okay, yes, life is primarily suffering. But overcoming suffering and adversity is one of the most valuable, meaningful things that one can experience. And you are depriving the non-existent of the opportunity to conquer these hardships. To which my response would be that, of course, there's potential value in overcoming certain forms of adversity for those of us that already exist. There's no shortage of examples to be found of human beings squandering tons of potential and causing themselves and others tons of needless suffering out of a lack of respect and understanding for the capacity to suffer that exists in all of us. Without certain forms of struggle and discipline, there can be no growth. And suffering has the potential to teach us valuable lessons that we otherwise never would have learned. I'm not denying this for a second. But imposing the potential for great suffering onto a being in the hopes that they'll come out the other side stronger for it would clearly be incredibly irrational and unethical, especially from this having a child for the child's sake perspective, and especially considering that in the vast majority of cases, suffering does not act as a constructive catalyst for growth. No, most of the time it robs people of potential for good. Consider the majority of lifelong drug addicts and violent crime offenders who come from incredibly rough, oftentimes traumatic upbringings. People who are abused as children are far more likely to stay with abusive partners or become an abuser as an adult. People who are raised by horrible parents are far more likely to become horrible parents. Everyone loves a good underdog story. But those who are able to transform their excess suffering into compassion and go on to live fulfilling lives, these people are the incredible exceptions, but not the rule. The vast majority of the suffering that has occurred on this planet has been entirely non-constructive. Just eating away at the inflicted individual until their inevitable death. More often acting as a harmful catalyst for further purposeless suffering rather than as a catalyst for meaningful growth. The majority of the people who make this suffering is good type argument are acting as though they have some accurate conception of what it feels like to completely succumb to the absolute worst of it. And it's clear that the majority of those who do have more of a conception of suffering, those who are caught up in it with no foreseeable end in sight, it's clear that these people are attempting to cope and justify the suffering that they are having to endure. And this is completely understandable. There's no use in dwelling on things that are out entirely out of our command. And if there's a way for us to be more accepting of our own unfixable predicaments, then this is of course ideal. Maybe even if acceptance can only be reached through a form of self-deception. The issue arises when certain forms of delusion end up contributing to even more purposeless suffering, as is often the case. Like when people go to such great lengths to justify their own suffering that they begin to justify suffering for its own sake. They come to the realization that much of their own subjective suffering has helped them in becoming a better, stronger human being, so they make a giant leap and claim therefore suffering is good. To sum it up, the non-existent are not being deprived of anything. There's no reason to create need that doesn't need to exist, especially considering the potential for extreme suffering that you would be opening them up to. A level of suffering that is beyond our comprehension.